Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm going to be reviewing the movie The Amazing Spider-Man. Since I live in South Korea, every once in a while a movie comes out here before it does back home in the US. And Amazing Spider-Man happens to be one of those movies. I went and caught it last night. I thought about doing the review then when I got home, but by then it was almost 10:30 and I'd been out and about all day and I was just plain beat, so here it is. Anyway, since this is an origin movie, I'm sure a lot of folks out there are probably going to be comparing it to the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie from several years back. I'm going to try and avoid doing that too awful much, simply because I want to review and give my opinion of this movie entirely on its own merits. And so, with that said, let's get right into it. Now, I'll talk about the plot a little bit as I go along and in more in depth later, but as I like to do around here, we're going to focus mainly on what's going on with the characters. And this being a Spider Man movie, of course, our main character is none other than Peter Parker, who here is played by a fellow by the name of Andrew Logan, is I believe his name. Um, he okay, here's where first of all I do have to genuinely make a comparison between this movie and the previous Spider-Man trilogy. The question of, Andrew Logan versus Tobey Maguire. Well, frankly, I really don't have a whole lot to say there, as I think both guys did a really good job in their respective movies. I know I was certainly, when I first saw it, extraordinarily impressed with his Tobey Maguire's performance as Spider-Man, especially at the very end where he goes, who am I? I'm Spider-Man. I thought that was great. Now, Andrew Logan, he's got obviously a very different movie to work with here, but he does a great job with it. You see a lot of that angst in Peter. You see his anger. As has been said, behind a lot of funny people, behind a lot of very smart people, there is a very angry person. And you can see some of that in Peter, especially when he kind of gains his power, the way he goes after those muggers, the way he lashes out at Flash Thompson. Peter's a guy who's put up with a lot in his life, and it's no wonder that he does have that anger underneath him. Now, we also, of course, the other big thing with Peter Parker is that he is a genius. As I've said in my Ultimate Spider-Man reviews, the comics sort of make him very good at a lot of things, but that his main focus is on biochemistry. Well, we don't get a huge amount of the specifics of what Peter is good at, but we do see him being shown to be, of course, good at computers, good with mechanics, because in this movie he has the stupid webcam. He has the non-organic web shooters. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, if I remember. And of course, he doesn't invent his spider fluid. He takes an already existing product from, of all places, Oscorp, and refines it into something that suits his personal needs. So on that aspect, of course, I think the movie does a great job. Now, the other main aspect of Spider-Man, of course, is that he's a funny guy. Now, we didn't get to see, unfortunately, a huge amount of this. Spider-Man in the Tobey Maguire movies, I admit, didn't do a lot of snarking and making fun of the bad guys. And there are practical considerations to this. In the comics, talking is basically a free action. Spider-Man, in the course of what should be literally seconds, tosses off paragraphs of mockery and commentary and all this other nonsense that really is just impossible in the real world. But here we do get shades of that. Of course, the scene with Peter taking down the car thief and that whole do you think I'm a cop dressed like this? And oh no, small knives, my one weakness. So I thought that was something that was really missing from the previous Spider-Man movies, and I was very happy to see it here. Now, granted, of course, they can't do it on the level that we see in the comics, and that's just out of sheer reality works differently than in the comics. So I can't hold that as a criticism against the movie. And especially given how really dark and very serious this movie was at times, I can also understand how they didn't really pour the humor on too hard. There was enough of it that we did see that side of Peter, that side of Spider-Man. We got a great, really funny scene out of it. His snarky side popped up a few other places, but it didn't really become overwhelming. It was there in a way that enhanced the story. It gave us an aspect of Spider-Man that we, the fans, have come to know and love and want to see, but it didn't dominate the movie. It did not denigrate the drama of what was going on. It really was basically a case of just enough. Now let's see, what else? Of course, you can't really talk about Peter Parker without the whole line of, with great power comes great responsibility. And one of my disappointments with this movie is that those words were never exactly uttered. Now, granted, we do get the big speech from Uncle Ben about how Peter's father believed, and if you have the power to help people, you should do it. And we of course see that Peter's actions leading to Uncle Ben's death. But again, we never hear the exact words, with great power comes great responsibility. And honestly, I think those words needed to be there. They are really Spider-Man's mission statement, for lack of a better term. They are the words that guide everything he does in his life. They are the words of Uncle Ben, and that the words that really hang over Spider-Man in everything he does. And not having them there, I really do think that took away from the story. And also, another thing that I like that and this is from the more recent interpretations of Spider-Man's origins, is, and now I don't claim to be an expert on the comic books from the 60s. All right, I have read some of the really classic Spider-Man stuff, but the more recent interpretations, things like Ultimate Spider-Man and the like, we do get to see that when Peter is given this power, he's not above basically using it to get even with Flash Thompson. Now, granted, in the comics, I think back then, even then, he occasionally pulled the occasional little prank on it. But I remember in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, there was a story where not long after Peter got his spider powers, Flash was giving a hard time. Peter just decided he'd had enough of it. They got into a fight, and he broke Flash Thompson's arm. Now here we see Peter doesn't really go that far. He just more or less makes a fool out of Flash. And honestly, apart from breaking that the backboard, which he apparently didn't even wasn't even forced to pay for, Peter still got the principal. Principal still called Uncle Ben down on him. I'm not sure exactly what for. I mean, making a jock look silly in gym class? I mean, seriously, that's something that you could easily write off as a prank. And even then, Peter wasn't really doing anything to Flash other than just sort of keep messing with him a little bit. And given the fact that Flash apparently got away with picking up another student and shoving his face into a pile of food and then punching and kicking Peter, for all we know, suffering no consequence for this, Peter having a parent brought in for screwing around with a guy on the basketball court, that just seems extraordinarily excessive. And the fact that he apparently had to do, well, okay, I don't really know exactly how to interpret community service, but apparently he did get some sort of slap on the wrist for it. And look, I work in schools. I worked in education for a couple of years now, and I know that schools are very extraordinarily sensitive these days to anything that reeks of bullying, but I just really can't see that Peter did anything that would really get the book thrown at him, or basically have the school come down on him for any real reason. And even if they did, Flash is unquestionably guilty of far worse. So if you're going to go down that route in the story, at least address that aspect of it. Don't just hand wave it away, or not even give it a hand wave. Just let us proceed on the assumption that because he's a jock, Flash gets away with everything. Come on. if you're going to do, if the nerdy guy is going to get in trouble for just sort of screwing around a little bit with another guy on the basketball court, the guy who's actually genuinely guilty of bullying and assault should not get a free pass without a word. So of that, let's also talk about Peter's relationship with Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Now, one thing that I'm sure is probably going to raise a little hackles with some of the more hardcore fans out there is that in the movie reality here, Peter actually knew his parents. Well, in the comics, they died while he was like still a toddler or something like this. Here, Peter's maybe 6 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. So there is that. Honestly, I don't really have a problem with that. Excuse me a second. Yeah, I think I might be getting a little bit of a summer cold, so sorry about that. I don't really think it changes very much, if anything. I mean, they've also changed the fact that in this reality, Peter's parents are apparently Oscorp scientists, where in the comic book reality, they were, believe it or not, agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So, honestly, I think these are ultimately trivial changes. And Peter having that relationship that we see early on in the movie with his parents, I actually think that enhances the story in some way, because in the comics, the way it is that they're just these nebulous figures, these people that Peter knows of. He's wanted to have an emotional connection with them, but he has no real memories of them. They're just really phantoms. Here, these are people that Peter genuinely does have real memories of. And that final night, that last night that with his parents, is something that has clearly haunted him. And we even see when he lashes out later on in Uncle Ben that he's still resentful towards his parents. They went away from him. They left him with Aunt May and Uncle Ben for reasons he doesn't understand to this day. And then they died. And of course, even though they died in a plane crash, something that, well, clearly was not their fault, Peter, in a way, still blames them. He blames them for dying. He blames them for leaving him. And that's a very different motivation than what's going on with Peter and his parents in the comics. But again, in the context of the story that is being told in the movie, I think it really works. Now, since we kept bringing them up, let's talk about Peter's relationship with Aunt May and Uncle Ben. So I actually like a little bit of what we're seeing here in this relationship. In the comics, particularly the stuff from the 60s, Aunt May and Uncle Ben were just flat out presented as just saints, really. They never got mad at Peter or anything like that. After Uncle Ben was gone, Aunt May would occasionally express disappointment because he was running around acting like Spider-Man. Excuse me. Peter, apparently being forgetful or being irresponsible because he let the Peter Parker aspect of the life slide by in favor of, well, putting on the Spider-Man costume and going out and saving people. And again, Aunt May would occasionally express disappointment in Peter for what she perceived to be irresponsibility, but she was never really that. She never really got that on his case that bad for it. Here we see with Uncle Ben, Uncle Ben gets angry at Peter. I mean, he even shouts at him a few times. And from his perspective, yeah, he does have a right to be angry. And even Aunt May gets angry and yells at him a little bit. Not out of anything malicious, it's just their feelings are hurt, or they feel that Peter has not really lived up to important responsibilities, or that he's just not treating them the way he should treat members of his family. I mean, their reasons for being angry and upset with him are all completely valid. And I like that because it simply makes the Parkers feel more like a real family. Because even no matter how much you love your family, no matter how well you get along, these disputes are just going to happen between family members. It's a part of life. And seeing it here, as I said, it just makes the Parkers feel more like a real family. It makes them feel more grounded. So, of course, our other relationship with our other deal with Peter is, and speaking of parents, I actually think that in a way fathers are a bit of a theme in this movie. Now of course we see immediately Peter's relationship with his biological father, Richard Parker. We don't get to see a whole lot of it, but it looks like they seem to have a good relationship. And obviously Peter's parents put his safety above everything else that's going on. The first thing they do when they realize that something has gone wrong is they rush to make sure that Peter is somewhere safe before they go off and start dealing with this. Sorry, I think I might be getting a little bit of a summer cold. Anyway, of course, Peter's main, father relationship is with Uncle Ben. And I've just talked about the sort of, less than stellar aspects of their relationship, the conflicts that naturally arise between family members. But of course, we've also seen Uncle Ben giving Peter important advice. We've seen him instilling discipline in Peter when he feels it is necessary. We've seen Uncle Ben joking around with Peter. We see Uncle Ben, kind of giving Peter a little nudge when it comes to girls that he likes. And yeah, I think I'm really getting a cold here. Whew. Anyway, let's soldier on here. And just all around generally being a good father, being what a father should be towards Peter. And then we move on to Kurt Connors. Now, this is a more subtle thing, but you can see a little bit of that sort of father-mentor relationship between Peter and Kurt. Peter really wants to connect with this guy, not just because he can answer questions about what was going on with the mystery project that Richard Parker left behind before he died, but this is somebody who knew his father, who knew an aspect of his father that Uncle Ben and Aunt May don't really know anything about. And we do see that bond form very quickly between Peter and Kurt. Kurt even apologizes to Peter for being a bad friend to his family. And we see in that scene that he really did genuinely care, not just about Richard and Mary, but even about Peter. So we do see them sort of form that bond because Kurt does see, obviously, quite a bit of his dead friend in Peter. And Peter here sees that the man that is so, as he understands it, so like his father. And he wants Kurt Connors' approval. You can tell. So we do see that relationship. And that's why it is, so hurts Peter so much that ultimately he is the one who sets Kurt Connors on the path to being the Lizard. And of course we have our final sort of father relationship, and that is Peter's relationship with Captain Stacy, played by all people of Denis Leary. Of course, Denis Leary is a very well-known comedian, and he's been doing quite well in dramatic acting on the show Rescue Me for several seasons now. So he was a little bit of a surprise in terms of casting for me, but I know that he can pull drama off, and I really got no complaints about his performance here. But I'll talk a little bit more about Captain Stacy's individual character later on. But let's focus in on Peter's aspect of Peter's sort of fatherish relationship with him. Now here, in contrast to Kurt Connors, we have Captain Stacy, who, while Kurt Connors embraces Peter Parker, Captain Stacy apparently doesn't seem to be, through Peter's own actions, is not the biggest Peter Parker fan in the world, and he is firmly opposed to Spider-Man. But however, in that scene with the two of them at the dinner table, we see that Captain Stacy is indeed making perfectly valid points about why he doesn't like Spider-Man. And Peter is also making reasonable points about why Spider-Man is good. Now, I've said before that one of the smartest things I've heard said about drama is that it's the best drama comes not from the clash of a great good against a great evil. The best drama comes from a clash between a great good and another great good. So here we have the clash between Peter as Spider-Man, somebody who we know is a good guy who wants to do the right thing, who wants to help people, who wants justice for his uncle. And here we have Captain Stacy, a guy who wants law, he wants order, he wants to protect the people of New York, and who is basically correct in that Spider-Man is a vigilante. So in this case, even though these two characters are in conflict with each other, they're both correct. And of course, at the end, we get to see the big battle between where Captain Stacy and Peter team up to take down the Lizard. Now, previously, of course, the police had captured Spider-Man, and Captain Stacy had even pulled off his mask, and it was seeing Peter. And even though they did have that conversation, that rather antagonistic conversation at dinner, Peter did impress Captain Stacy enough with his integrity, with his belief, that Captain Stacy, in looking back on this, was able to see, I understand why Peter is doing this. And I'm going to assume that Gwen told Captain Stacy about Peter's uncle being murdered. So, with that revelation of who Spider-Man is, of course, everything that Peter said at dinner falls into place. And there, Captain Stacy is able to see that even though he is using methods that he personally doesn't approve of, Peter is doing these things out of a genuine sense and a genuine desire to do good, to help people. And at this point, Captain Stacy has also realized that he's in over his head. What the Lizard is throwing out there at the NYPD, I mean, he's already turned, about half a dozen cops into lizard people, is simply beyond his abilities. He needs someone as extraordinary as Spider-Man in order to do what needs to be done for the good of the city, and for the good of his family. So we do see that he's able to he lets Peter go. They team up, and we do see Captain Stacy stand against the Lizard, and he holds his ground pretty well. Now, granted, he's able to do that because for some reason there's large amounts of liquid nitrogen hanging out on the roof of an office building in Manhattan. Yeah. But anyway, of course, he does really well, but the Lizard has superhuman healing powers and is able to mortally wound and ultimately kill Captain Stacy. And then at the very end of it all, we see Peter back there, a dying father figure before him, imparting last words to him. Now, one thing that I didn't like about how Uncle Ben died in this movie is that he just died there in the street. He never really got to say anything to Peter at all. And I really think that was a mistake. I wanted there to be something there. Now, yes, we had the voicemail message, but that's just really not the same as the last words of someone you love as they die in your arms. But of course, here, what Captain Stacy says is really he wants Peter's promise to stay away from his daughter. And it is perfectly understandable why he would do this. I mean, getting involved in Spider-Man's world has cost Captain Stacy his life. He knows he's just moments away from dying. And he even probably knows that, may even be thinking that being around Peter caused Uncle Ben to die. I mean, he doesn't know that Peter's actions helped set that in motion, but he does know that here, people are dying around Peter. He does understand that Peter is probably going to make enemies as Spider-Man, and that he may even understand that he's entered a whole new world where people like the Lizard exist, or that the Lizard may not be the last person of that caliber to end up running around New York, and it's perfectly understandable as to why he doesn't want his daughter around that, because, well, look at the price he's having to pay. And of course, Peter agrees. Now, let's skip to the movie ahead. Oh, I guess I probably should have said at some point earlier on that there's going to be a lot of spoilers in this, but I'm sure you figured that out by now. We see that Peter, again emotionally devastated, tries to honor Captain Stacy's wish. He sees what ignoring the words of his father and mentor figures has cost him, and he doesn't want, of course, anything to happen to Gwen. But of course, Gwen sees right through Peter. And of course, she knows her father well enough to see his hand in all of this. And here's the part we come to where Captain Stacy, while he did do what he did with the best of intentions, the same way Spider-Man is a vigilante with the best of intentions, that he was ultimately wrong. Because Gwen, even though she's still in high school, is of course almost an adult. Even as her father, even wanting the best for her, he doesn't have the right to ask other people, but especially under such circumstances where they really just could not say no, to stay away from Gwen. It is simply not his decision to make for her. And I'm glad that they ultimately chose not to go down that route. I'm sure there are some people who are going to call Peter a liar or whatever, but no. Ultimately, at the end of the day, despite his good intentions, Captain Stacy simply did not have the right to ask Pete to make that decision for Gwen about her life. Okay, it's Gwen's life. She has the right to choose whether or not Peter is a part of it. And as we've seen from this movie, at this point, she certainly does understand that this comes with risks, but there seem to be risks that she's willing to take. So, since I brought her up, let's talk about Gwen Stacy's character here. Now, in more recent interpretations of Gwen Stacy, honestly, like in the last Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man 3, they've sort of gone down the route of making Gwen a kind of a science student. Honestly, in the comics, I don't remember what it was she was studying in college. I don't know if they ever said, and if I really dig into my fanboy instincts on this, I think it might have actually been said that she was studying law, but don't quote me on that. In whatever the case, I'm pretty sure back in the original stories with Gwen Stacy from like the late 60s and the early 70s, I'm pretty sure she was not a science student. But again, I could be wrong. So here in this movie and in Spider-Man 3, they're sort of putting her down on that path to try and make her someone who's a little bit more on Peter's level, make her more Peter's equal in a way. And for one thing, I don't really think that's necessary. Because, well, Mary Jane, while obviously a very smart lady, is no scientist in any way, shape, or form. But in the comics, they've had absolutely no problems, at least the good Spider-Man writers, presenting Mary Jane as Peter's equal in every way, despite not being a science person, despite not having superpowers or anything like that. So, taking that route, I don't think it just really rings true to the Gwen Stacy character. Now, I understand that they kind of want to get away from the fact that Peter was mostly dating Gwen because she was, nice and hot, but I don't know. It's just something I don't particularly care for. But that said, I really do have no problems with Emma Stone's performance as Gwen Stacy. She certainly takes the material she's given. She works with it well. I can see why Peter is attracted to this character. I have no problem believing that she's this very smart person, this very strong-willed person. She obviously gets a lot of that strong will from her dad. She and her dad have a good relationship. She's somebody who can stand with Peter and be that equal, that other person that he needs in this world. Now, is it going to last? Are they going to introduce Mary Jane later on in the movies? Or maybe we're even going to get to see Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat, who's always been a favorite character of mine. I don't know. But overall, Gwen Stacy, while the way she is presented is very different from the comics, and the way I personally would go with the character. I really don't have too much problems with the way it is presented. While they do basically while they have made choices that I don't particularly agree with in terms of storytelling, they through the writing and the direction and the acting, they do sell those choices well. So while they may not be the ones that I would go with, they are presented well enough that I can overlook my own personal disagreements with these choices. Now, Gwen, in terms of storytelling, doesn't really have a huge amount going on. She's mostly there just sort of, well, I hate to say it, to be the love interest, and honestly to be a lot of Deus Ex Machina. I mean, really, the daughter of the police captain who's really got the mad on for Spider-Man also happens to be the assistant to the mad scientist who Peter gave the information to, who is also the friend of Peter's father. Really? Boy, there are sure a huge amount of just coincidences that even Charles Dickens would laugh at in this movie. And also, I find it a little odd that, as smart as she is, that they're going to let somebody who's not even legally an adult, or even if she is 18, still in high school, hang around to be the personal assistant to the the world's greatest herpetologist and this extraordinarily brilliant scientist. I mean, seriously, there's not a grad student somewhere that couldn't do this job better and not have to be out of the office from like 8 to 3:30 or whatever hours they have at Midtown High. Oh, and speaking of which, did you notice that here in the movie, it's Midtown Science High School? So Peter is apparently at a magnet school, I think that's the school, for science students. While in the comics, he's just at an ordinary high school in Queens. Okay, I can understand that. It would actually make sense that in this day and age, somebody as smart as Peter would go to a school like that. Question though, what the heck is somebody like Flash Thompson doing there though? Flash doesn't seem like a very sciencey sort of guy. In fact, his presentation in the comics makes it seem otherwise. In fact, we even get Gwen Stacy showing up to rather throw it in his face that he's getting tutored and not doing too good at it either. But, it's just not Spider-Man if Flash Thompson isn't there in high school being a dick to him, so... Hey, and you know what? As long as we're doing that, let's take a moment and talk about Flash Thompson as a character in this movie. Now, forgive me if I don't really recall the name of the actor that's playing him, but in the previous Spider-Man movies, we see Flash for all of like 5 minutes, and he's just there in high school to be a jerk to Peter, and then be Mary Jane's crummy boyfriend. And then, after less than 5 minutes total screen time, he's gone. We never see him again. He's never mentioned again. Here, Flash actually gets a little bit of character growth as a character. We see him, of course, at first being a big bully. Then we get to see Peter giving him a hard time, getting some payback that is pretty well deserved for all the stuff that Flash has done to him, and undoubtedly to the other nerdy people at the school. But after the lizard attacks, we do get that scene out in the parking lot where we can see that Flash is genuinely freaked out. He's kind of traumatized by all this. And I don't know, who can blame him? I mean, if some sort of lizard monster showed up and started trashing your high school, and you had to literally flee for your life, yeah, you would be shaken. Later on, we see Gwen Stacy at the very end mention that Flash even came to her father's funeral. And I thought that was a very subtle thing. It really was a barb that would definitely get through Peter's armor, and again, shows that Flash is not incapable of empathy. Because earlier on the scene, we do see where he actually tries to go and give Peter his condolences on Uncle Ben's death, and Peter lashes out at him. And after he's explained, like, Parker, I just wanted to say sorry about what happened to your uncle, Peter just sort of walks away from him, and Flash is not upset. Flash shows understanding. He shows compassion. He shows empathy. And then at the very end of the movie, we see Flash wearing the Spider-Man t-shirt, reminiscent of how in the comics Flash was an extraordinary, especially in the 60s, was this huge booster for Spider-Man, but still thought, Peter Parker was a useless tool. So the fact that they took the time to give Flash that depth of character, I think, really speaks well of the people who are making this movie, because Flash Thompson is a character who does have a long history in Spider-Man and has grown a lot over that time in history, and nowadays is, honestly, if you've been watching my reviews of the Ultimate Spider-Man TV show, you know that he's actually the one who controls the Venom symbiote now and is going out there trying to do good and be a hero. So yeah, I like that. So now that I think we've talked about everything that we need to talk about, Peter, and Flash, and Gwen, and Captain Stacy, let's talk about Kurt Connors here. Now, Kurt is a guy, and you will forgive me if I don't try and say the name of his actor. Apparently, he's Welsh, and he has one of those Welsh names that us native English speakers from the U.S. just are going to completely fall flat if we try and say. So please forgive me if I have no idea how to say that man's name properly. But I do think that he really was very, very good as the Lizard. We do see how that loss of his arm just hangs over Kurt. It makes him feel like less of a man. And it's sad that he chooses to focus on that aspect of himself, because we do see that Kurt Connors is a very brilliant scientist. He's a genuinely good person. When Norman Osborn's assistant or whatever is planning to go and start using the serum on unknowing people at a veterans hospital, the first thing he does as the Lizard is go out and try and stop this guy. Now, granted, that involved what looks like trying to kill him and also endangering the lives of God only knows how many people on, I think it was the Williamsburg Bridge. But still, Kurt's intentions were good. And even when he starts to lose his mind and be fully consumed by the Lizard aspect of his personality, that desire to help people is still there. It's just become, like Kurt, horribly twisted. He honestly thinks that turning the population of Manhattan into lizard people is going to be good for the world as a whole. And we see, and that is really one of the themes here, is that his good intentions are taken to the worst possible extreme. And that is a theme, that is something that has been going on with the Lizard for years and years in the comics. As it's, let me try that again. For years, it has been that driving thing that he does want to just have his arm back. He wants to be able to help people all over the world who have lost limbs in wars and in accidents and due to landmines and all this other thing. And it's just like in the comics, Kurt Connors cannot stay away from this. He cannot let it go and just simply accept the fact that his arm is gone. He keeps going again and again, trying to do something that will give that arm back to him. And of course, it always ends up turning him into the Lizard again. And of course, Spider-Man has to go and stop him. It is obsession. It is obsession that ultimately turns Kurt Connors into the Lizard. It is his inability to accept his limitations, his loss. And it is ultimately that obsession that starts him to become a threat to the entire population of New York City, and to turn on this guy, Peter Parker, who in many ways has become a surrogate son to him. And of course, to kill the father of Gwen Stacy, who apparently he was sort of mentoring, someone who, well, we don't see a huge amount of their relationship, but it is pretty clear that he does seem to think very highly of Gwen. Now, I wouldn't go as far as say it's a sort of father-daughter relationship, but he's clearly a mentor to her, and he clearly does seem to be very impressed with her and to genuinely want her to do well in life. So let's see, who else do we need to talk about? Let's see. I don't really have too much to say about the character of Aunt May. I've talked about her a little bit before. She is, of course, played quite well by the one and only Sally Field. she's an actress who's really she was actually quite a very big deal in like the mid '60s to like the early '70s. She's of course best known as the character of Gidget, who was basically the centerpiece character of the whole surf movie genre, and then later she was on The Flying Nun. Yes, there actually was a TV show called that. And in more recent years, she's done stuff like ER. She was on here again. As I said, like earlier, here Aunt May is a little bit more willing to get angry with Peter, and I do appreciate that because, as I said, that reflects a more realistic family dynamic. But that said, that compassion that Aunt May has, that love for Peter, that she has, that unconditional, unending love for him, that's there. That is one of the biggest things about Aunt May, and Sally Field really does pull that off. I do like that scene towards the very end where Peter comes in. He's obviously once again beaten all to heck, and he takes out the eggs and gives them to her. And that's just a scene that's great on so many levels. And it was also needed to show that while there are going to be problems, while being Spider-Man is important to him, Peter is not going to let this completely consume him. He is still going to try and look after the people that he cares for, and that he still cares greatly for Aunt May. And yeah, I really have no problems with Sally Field's performance here. I certainly have no problems with Martin Sheen's performance as Uncle Ben. And Martin Sheen, I mean, you don't get resumes in Hollywood much better than Martin Sheen. Although if you're one of those maybe a younger person and you're like, man, where do I know this guy from? Well, more recently he's gotten quite a bit of exposure as the voice of the elusive man in the Mass Effect games. And I seem to recall he was also on the little show called The West Wing not that long ago, if I remember correctly. Been a while. But anyway, I think that's all I really have to say for the moment about characterization. So let's talk about the plot of the movie. The one thing that I think really I had the hardest problem with while watching this movie is I just know the origin of Spider-Man. I've been reading the comics for years. I've seen the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. I've seen the 90s cartoon show. I've seen a couple of Spider-Man cartoon shows. I've read the Ultimate Spider-Man comics. I know the origin of Spider-Man. Now, again, this is a reboot, of course, so they're going to give us the whole thing again. And while they do it really well, it just like, look, I just want to say, I know the origin of Spider-Man. Can I please see Peter in the costume, punching the lizard in the face now? Part of me kind of wishes that they'd sort of gone in the direction that X-Men First Class did, in that we do get a lot of explanation as to mutants and all this other stuff, but it's sort of taken as a given that we understand certain details of these characters from the movies that in that timeline happened later on. If they'd kind of gone that route and just sort of focused more in on the more Spider-Man superhero-y side of things, I think I might have liked it better. But the thing is that pop culture is extremely cyclical. Boy, I hope I said that word right. So it's not uncommon, especially in comics. I mean, just look at DC Comics, how they seem to reboot the continuity about every 10 to 20 years, where they go back and they tell the origin story of these characters again. They reinterpret them for more modern times. And that's what we're looking at here. It has been quite a while since the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie. And since that time, a whole new generation of people has risen into their teen years, into their young their young childhoods and all this other stuff, for whom that's maybe they've seen that movie and maybe they haven't. So here's the new Spider-Man movie. Here's the new movie origin of Spider-Man presented to them in the world of 2012, the world that they know. And that's not a mark against the movie, that's just the nature of pop culture. But again, as I said, as somebody who knows the origin of Spider-Man, it's sort of like being told the origin of Superman again. Even if you're not a comics person, you probably know the origin of Superman. Like Laura and Jor-El and baby Kal-El on the rocket from Krypton to Earth, where he's found by John and Martha Kent. He grows up to become Superman, fights Lex Luthor, blah blah blah. Well, I think Spider-Man at this point has reached enough of a place in popular culture that basically everybody knows the broad strokes of the origin of Spider-Man. Now, that said, they do use the time before he becomes Spider-Man in smart ways. We see the stuff on the subway where Peter is getting a hang of his superhuman strength with the sticky aspects of his hands, and accidentally tearing some woman's shirt off. I was actually a little surprised they got away with that in something that's obviously going to have so many kids in the audience. But anyway, we also, of course, see Peter developing the web shooters and somehow being able to afford industrial strength airplane towing goo from Oscorp on the allowance of a poor kid from Queens. Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense at all. I mean, I can't imagine that stuff is affordable to the average everyday Joe. But, hey, I'm willing to overlook that. And I was actually a little surprised by how much I thought the whole skateboarding thing. We see Peter doing the skateboard. We see him taking the skateboard to school. We see it getting broken by some guys on the subway. And then he apparently seems to use sort of some of that as the basis of his moves as Spider-Man. Now, as far as I know, the only real connections that Spider-Man has had to skateboarding is that apparently he was an unlockable alternate costume in a Tony Hawk game, and one of Spider-Man's more ridiculous foes is a guy on a rocket-powered skateboard called Rocket Racer. But that said, given the amount of precision and balance you need to do skateboarding, and the amount of precision and balance you're going to need to swing around Manhattan the way Spider-Man does, okay, I can kind of buy that as a starting point for Peter's abilities as Spider-Man. And of course, we get to see our superhero training sequence at what I'm guessing is apparently the docks or a Navy Yard or something like that. I don't know exactly where in Manhattan that would be, but I certainly have no problem believing there's a place like that. I've seen enough urban exploration pictures, and honestly, I just like that just for those scenes, just for the sheer visuals. That place where he was training, he was skateboarding, swinging around the trains. It was just visually a very interesting place. So I think that was all handled pretty well. I do have to say I like the actual costume from the previous Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi ones. Here, the Spider-Man costume, honestly, it looks like Peter made it out of a giant red and blue basketball. Now, it's not that it doesn't keep the spirit of the Spider-Man costume that we all know. It's just the last one was the Spider-Man costume that's been around since the 60s, really in every way that we could ever want. Here, we're looking at a slight variation. And while there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, as Spider-Man has worn many variations of his costume over the years, I think if you're going to do this, stick with what has worked for decade after decade. Let's see. So, one aspect that I did like of this movie was the Lizard's plot. His whole thing, like, I'm going to turn Manhattan into a bunch of lizard people like myself. That is totally something the Lizard would do in the comics. And I also like that they sort of played around with, the whole Kurt Connors versus the Lizard's voice in his head. Again, that's something that they do all the time in the comics. So, while Well, there are some aspects of the last Spider-Man movies that I like a good deal more than this. This movie, in terms of the story it tells, in many ways feels more like a Spider-Man comic book story than any of those previous movies. And in fact, it feels more like a comic book story than not like the vast majority of superhero movies, period. With, of course, Avengers being a very obvious exception. But anyway, there is that. So let's see, what else? I've already complained about the rather extraordinarily contrived coincidences which drive this movie. So let's see. I don't have my notes as usual. I'm doing this completely off the top of my head, so that's why I'm taking these moments to stop and think about it. Oh yeah, the construction workers. Well, basically, I thought that was a good attempt at a moment. Just the fact that, wow, what a completely fortuitous coincidence that the guy whose son Spider-Man saved is in charge of enough people that he can make all of them line up their cranes in such a way that it gives Spider-Man an easy path to the Oscorp building. And boy, how fortunate for Spider-Man that there are cranes in just the right position. So if they turn, he can have an easy path to the Oscorp building. Yeah, I mean, sorry, folks. There is really no way other to say that that's just plot contrivance on an absolutely ridiculous level. And I do feel a little strange saying that, given how much ridiculous coincidences are a plot of so many things that happen in comics. But, there it is as it applies to this movie. It's just one of those, like, really? I understand that you're trying to make me feel good about this. I understand that this is really meant to show those moments that we do occasionally get in the comics where the people of New York are actually appreciative of Spider-Man's efforts, but it's just not enough to override what a humongous contrivance this is. And I've, of course, also talked about how it's really odd that the good folks at Oscorp would keep huge amounts of liquid nitrogen just sitting around on the roof of a building. Wouldn't it make much more sense to keep that someplace like a freezer? Or someplace where you would have machinery that requires liquid nitrogen to keep things cold? I mean, unless the Oscorp building has like the most badass air conditioner on the face of the planet, I can't think of any reason in the world why there are huge canisters of liquid nitrogen hanging around on the top of a Manhattan office building. But anyway, one thing that I do want to talk about before we wrap this up is their choice of villains. Now, we haven't seen the Lizard as a villain in any of the previous Spider-Man movies, and frankly, I'm glad that they went this route. There's just too much that they have to establish, too much that they have to sell us on with, new Peter Parker, new Aunt May, new Uncle Ben, new Gwen Stacy, new Flash Thompson, all this, for them to really go dipping into the villains that have been done before. And honestly, I kind of hope that we don't get a new version of Dr. Octopus later on, because, well, you're going to have a pretty darn hard time topping Alfred Molina in Spider-Man 2. I mean, he was just fantastic as Dr. Octopus there. Now, that said, Norman Osborn is, of course, a lurking... He's not seen, he's only mentioned, but he is portrayed as being something of a lurking menace. And as we, of course, know, it is, in the modern Spider-Man comics, firmly established that it is Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, and not Dr. Octopus, who is Spider-Man's arch enemy. So I do think that, of course, they're probably going to go for the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, as the big villain of the next Spider-Man movie. And I don't really have any problem with that. Not to take anything away from Willem Dafoe's performance as Norman Osborn, but like a lot of fans, I had my issues with that particular interpretation of the character. And, well, let's face it, Harry as the not even the Hobgoblin in Spider-Man 3. It was just really sort of a dumb waste. So Norman is set up there. He can potentially be the villain of the next Spider-Man movie. I'm just going to assume that they're aiming for a trilogy here, and in case they decide to bring in some other villain, there's plenty of folks from the Spider-Man Rogues Gallery to choose from. And then, of course, we can get the big final showdown between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin in the third movie. So anyway, let's wrap this up. Overall, this is really just a very good Spider-Man movie. Now, whether or not you like it better than the first Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie, that's just going to be a matter of personal taste. I'm leaning a little bit towards this movie at the moment simply because the story that it tells, like with the lizard trying to turn Manhattan into lizard people and all this, it just feels in so many ways much closer to the comics in terms of storytelling in that regard. Now, not that this movie doesn't have its flaws, I've mentioned them quite extensively. But again, it is really just going to be a matter of taste. And there really is no right or wrong on this one. And overall, as a superhero movie, it's of course suffers from having to spend the vast majority of the movie telling us the hero's origin. But it does it very well, and while it can sort of make the roughly 2.5 hours that this movie runs seem like a long time at times, it still does its job and it does it well. And of course, the writing, the acting, the direction, and of course, and even more, and just as importantly, the music. The music in this movie is used very subtly, but it's used very, very well, is all top-notch stuff. So again, overall, I give a really big thumbs up to The Amazing Spider-Man. It's definitely a good Spider-Man movie, and it's certainly on the very high end in terms of quality of superhero movies in general, and frankly, just as a movie in and of itself, it's pretty darn good. So if you're into these sort of movies, if you like superheroes, if you like action movies, if you like sci-fi stuff, or if you just like good movies in general, definitely give The Amazing Spider-Man a shot. Anyway, folks, that's all I have for you now. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter @HoosierJedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.